Hi there, everyone. I can see a few people still joining, but I think we will kick off now. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Green Match Fund webinar today. My name is Alex Day. I'm the director of the Big Give. We're really grateful to Janine from the FSI for joining us this afternoon, particularly given that it's her son's first birthday today. So Janine, we're really grateful for you joining and looking forward to what you have to say. Just to set the scene to everyone, firstly, thanks so much for applying and well done on getting this far. It's safe to say we had a really positive response from charities applying for the Green Match Funds, our first year of running it, and we very much hope that this will become an annual fixture, both in the kind of Big Give campaign calendar and in the kind of wider fundraising space for the environmental sector. We had a good response as well from champion funders providing match funding for this particular campaign. So yeah, well done on getting this far. I know for some charities they didn't get quite as much as the match funding that they'd applied for, but yeah, as I said, competition was very high for match funds. So we hope that something is better than nothing, and we're really looking forward to supporting you in the campaign this year. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sahil, who will explain how the next kind of 90 minutes or so will work. And yeah, look forward to hearing all of your input from today's session. So thank you again for joining.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Sahil, I'm the Partnerships Manager at the Big Give. So I may have probably spoken to many of you via email, so hopefully it's good for face to the name. Yeah, thanks again, Janine, for joining us on your son's first birthday. The next hour and a half will go like this. We'll let Janine sort of host the webinar until 1:15, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for some Q&A. If you can put any questions you have for us or Janine in the Q&A function at the bottom of your your Zoom webinar panel, and then we'll pick out the questions and ask them to Janine in the Q&A session, and we'll also be answering questions as we go along via the chat function. And if you want to introduce yourself to any of the charities, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. Please make sure the to function is set to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what you're saying. And yeah, thank you again for joining us, and now I'll hand over to Janine to take over.
Brilliant, welcome everyone. I'm just scrolling through the chat, and thanks for those that have wished birthday wishes, that's really kind of you. But I'm just blown away by the range of causes and organisations joining the webinar today, so I'm really excited to be here with you. Alex mentioned I'm from an organisation called the FSI. We've been really pleased to partner with the Big Give for several years now. So if you've participated in the Christmas challenge before, you might recognise me or my voice, or several of my colleagues who have supported with some of the webinars as well. But today, over the next hour and a half or so, what we're really looking to do is just to cover the key steps that we want you to think about when you're putting your campaign together. So in your resources section, in your charity area of the Big Give, you will have access, I'm hoping I'm right here, Sahil, you'll have access to a marketing guidebook that goes into this in more depth, but this is about sort of bringing that to life, walking you through the steps, but giving you some case studies and some examples and inspiration from past Big Give participants and those that have gone on to win awards for their campaigns. So we're going to walk through the key steps, how to plan your campaign, thinking about your audience, how to craft and hone your message, and getting the word out there, thinking about the promotional channels that you're going to use. And as Sahil said, we've got time at the end for Q&A. So my aim is to finish by about 1:10, 1:15 to give plenty of time for questions. What we might do is just pause at the end of each section just to see what questions have come through. And I might answer some of them as we go. But if they are questions that I know are coming up later on in the session, then I'll defer them to the end. So please do keep introducing yourself through the chat. If you drop in your name and where you're from, I'm really interested to read about how many of you are doing this for the first time, which is exciting. And in fact, actually, we've got a poll for that. If Sahil, if you don't mind launching the poll for me. There's 4 options there. So it's both yours and your charity's first campaign with the big give. The second option is that it's your first campaign, the first time you're doing it, but maybe your charity has participated before. No, we've not. So there's a typo there. Sorry, that's my fault, typing too quickly. No, we've not participated in other campaigns before, or you're just unsure. So if you can add your votes in, and we'll just give it a minute or so for those to come through, and then I'll get Sahil to share the results back so we can see them. So as indicated through the comments in the chat, so for 3/4 of it's both yours and your charity's first campaign, and then another chunk where it's your first campaign, although your charity has participated before. And then about sort of, I think it's 13% of you have participated in other campaigns before. That's just really helpful for me. It just gives me a little bit of understanding of where people are at before we go into the session. So just a quick reminder of the campaign. So the campaign dates will run from midday on Thursday, the 22nd of April to midday on Thursday, the 29th of April. So there's a week of activity there. I mentioned before, your dashboard is the key point to access resources to help you market the campaign. So the guidebook is a really good starting point, but there'll be other assets and resources there as well. From my experience of having planned and delivered a couple of the Christmas challenge campaigns for a charity that I'm a trustee of, get that planning started as soon as possible and get your plans underway. You'll be amazed at how helpful it can be to be planning and preparing as much as you can in advance, and it takes a lot of pressure and stress off the week itself. And I'd really encourage you, if you're a sole fundraiser or you're doing this like I was doing it with ours in a voluntary capacity and amongst many other things going on, as a trustee, find your fundraising crew and get their support around you. So now's the time to sort of involve and engage others who can help you with that planning and help you to implement your plans in the lead up and during the campaign. All of the match funds, so this is a bit different if you've done the Christmas challenge or one of the other big give campaigns before. It's a little bit different in that all of the match funds are provided by the big gives champions. So donations, however much you've been awarded in those champion funds, the donations will be matched until they're used up or until the campaign ends, whichever comes first. But even if you don't reach your donation target, whatever you do raise will still be matched. And if you reach your target before the campaign ends, you'll still be able to receive unmatched donations. And certainly, again, in my experience, and I know there is, it might be in the marketing guidebook, but there is such a lot of research about the impact of match funding campaigns on people's propensity to give. So it's a really powerful motivator, but also in terms of the overall donation levels, it tends to encourage people to give more as well, that match funding element. So really making the most of that opportunity. So let's jump into it. I'll just take a pause here in case anyone's got questions about the campaign mechanics itself, because I'll make sure that Sahil or Alex can answer those. So if you've got any specific questions about the mechanics of the campaign or how it works, now's a good opportunity to ask those, and then we can get into the sort of the planning and delivering your campaign. So if you've got questions, just drop them into the Q&A.
Janine, we did have one question just clarifying. Basically, I think this Soy was asking if money raised on other crowdfunding sites be matched. Unfortunately, we cannot match fund donations made on other websites. Donations must go through the charities campaign page on the Big Give website between the 2nd and 9th of April. And we also can't match offline donations, unfortunately. So we can only accept donations via debit or credit cards or Apple Pay.
Brilliant. Thank you for clarifying. And I think there's a few more questions that have popped up there as well, if you just want to tackle those.
I'll answer them as we go along.
Okay. Perfect. Brilliant. Okay. So let's start then with planning your campaign. And really at the outset, for any fundraising campaign or appeal, there's sort of 5 key steps that you want to go through. And we're going to look at each of these in turn in a bit more depth for today's webinar, but just to briefly touch on them. So starting with your objectives, it's really important that you've got some clear objectives for your challenge. And that is, it can be difficult to come up with your objectives or to come up with some really tightly defined objectives, especially if it's your first time doing it. But without having those in place, it's really difficult to assess how successful you've been or to learn from what worked and maybe what didn't to improve future campaigns as well. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking through objectives. Then it's about thinking about people. So who are you targeting your campaign at? Who are the different audiences? Because you might need to adapt your campaign messaging or maybe your promotional channels, the channels by which you reach those people, depending on your different audience segments. What's your proposition? What's your core underlying message that you're trying to get across? Even if you do tweak it for these different audiences, what's that core underlying proposition for why that answers the question, why should I support your campaign? And then the planning. So this is all about the detail, the scheduling, the identifying work to be done, ensuring in essence that you know what needs to be done by when and by whom, and both in the lead up to the challenge, but also throughout it and afterwards as well. It's really important not to miss that vital post-campaign sort of wrap up. Someone mentioned on one of the questions, accessing, getting information into your CRM if you've got one, sending thank yous, that ongoing stewardship and relationship development. So let's jump into the first of those 5, then your objectives. And if you've got your workbook, I'll be referring to particular pages in there, but you don't need access to it for today's webinar. So your objectives. Your objectives, we've often heard the acronym SMART. I just thought it would be helpful just to reiterate what we mean by those, what's the word I'm looking for, by those initials when we talk about a SMART objective. So your objective should be specific, and that it should define what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it in as specific terms as possible. And the sort of advice I always give is make sure it focuses on what success looks like, not how you'll achieve it. It should be measurable. It should be something you can quantify. So you might be setting some objectives around how much you want to raise, how many new supporters you want to engage. You might be thinking about post-campaign targets as well. How many donors to the campaign do you want to convert to being long-term supporters of your charity? It needs to be actionable, so you should be able to identify clear actions that you can take in order to achieve your objective. And finally, realistic. It's really important to find that balance between ambition and reality. It needs to be something that is a stretch, that feels exciting and feels like a challenge, but also you want to set a goal that you think you can realistically achieve. And then finally, time bound. I mean, I think the fact that the challenge takes place over a limited time period sort of automatically builds that in. It really creates a sense of urgency for your campaign, and importantly for your donors to give during that particular period of time that the campaign is running. So what I'd like you to do is just take a couple of minutes to think for yourself. What are your objectives for your campaign, and how might you improve them? You don't have to define them specifically now, but just think about how you might improve them to make them more smart. My tips for that would be define it. I've sort of mentioned it already in the specific, but define it in terms of performance or results, not the process. So instead of an objective being we'll email 3,000 people on our database, because that's telling you the what you're doing, the action. Instead, it's about securing 50 donations from our existing donor database. So the former you can see is more focused on an action or a task, something you might have on a to-do list. It's not really an objective. So think about what successful will look like and define it as specifically as you can. You might want to think about things like the number of new donors you want to engage, the total amount that you want to raise. Maybe if this isn't your first time running a campaign and you've got some past data to go by, you might be wanting to set some objectives around increasing your average gift level, for example, your average donation amount. It might be about those that go on to, in the longer term, go on to convert to be regular givers, for example, or to donate again. You might have some targets, a goal we set for ourselves in the charity that I'm a trustee of when we did the Christmas Challenge campaign last year, was a goal to, or an objective to have X number of people opt in to further communications from us. So we were really careful. That led us to be really careful about how we adapted some of the automated emails and thanking messages in particular that went to those individuals. So it's useful to set these objectives at the outset, but as you move through your campaign planning and you start to define your proposition, you think about your audiences and your promotional channels, you might go back, as part of them being realistic, you might go back and revisit those objectives just to make sure that they still feel realistic and relevant to your organization. So we gave in your workbook on page 4, we've given some examples of what a good SMART objective might look like versus a not so good SMART objective. So some examples around that were, some weaker objectives were around maximizing the fund by raising 10,000 from our supporters and networks, reach new supporters and develop greater awareness of our charity. The challenge with that is that it's not particularly measurable. Do you just need to reach 2 new supporters, or is it 20 new supporters, and how are you measuring awareness? Whereas if you look at the stronger examples, you can see they're much more specific to the donor segment. They've got clear, measurable, quantifiable things that you can measure. So achieve 5 donations of at least £500 from donors who can give a bigger gift, recruit 30 new donors at least £25. Those sort of examples are good objectives. So just take a moment to jot down what yours are, even if you need to come back and revisit that. And I'll just give you a minute or two for that as a pause before we move on to people. And if anyone's got any questions about objectives, you can ask them now.
Hi, Janine. There was a question from Gabrielle about how many objectives should they have. Is there like an optimum number? Does it depend on the charity?
I think it kind of comes down to personal preference. I tend to have somewhere between 3 and 5. Because I like an odd number, but I think if you have too many objectives, you start getting into too much granular detail, I suppose. If you have too few, it starts being too broad, and you're sort of back to that, it's not being specific anymore. If you've only got one objective, like the example that I gave about, maximize the campaign by raising £10,000. It's so broad that it doesn't really meet that test of being specific or actionable, and it's hard to know whether it's realistic as well. So yeah, somewhere between 3 and 5 is probably a good amount. Any other questions?
Can't see. There was a question for Claire. I'll just answer it. The workbook is available if you log into your account. Click on Big Give Campaigns. Click on Manage Campaign for Green Match Fund, and it will be available on the right-hand side to download as a PDF.
And you don't need it for today's webinar. It's just a future. I just wanted to give you the page reference to go back to if you had it to hand, or to go back to at a later date. Okay, brilliant. So let's move on to people then, the second area that we want to focus on in planning our campaign. So it's really helpful to start by thinking about the different groups of potential supporters that you've got around your organisation, because what we want to do is we don't want to have a one-size-fits-all approach with our communications. We might start to think about how do we break them up into different groups. So for example, it might be higher versus lower level donors. It might be those who have signed up to a newsletter or email updates, people who follow you on Facebook or volunteer for you, or maybe have come along to an event that you're running, or accessed a resource or a publication that you've produced. And you don't want to, a little bit like objectives, you don't want to over segment so that you end up having, 5 people in each category, but you've got like 30 different categories. But just think about how you might segment them quite broadly, because those different groups of people will have different motivations for supporting your organization. And they'll have different ways that they're keeping in touch with you as well. So, how does the profile of the people who follow your Facebook page, what do you know about them, and how is that different to the people who come along to your events, whether they're virtual or pre-pandemic were face-to-face? How do they differ from the people that volunteer for you or fundraise for you? So there isn't a sort of a definitive list of all of the supporter categories, but it's for you to think about who are those key sort of groups of people or organizations, and what's their underlying motivation, and how can we reach them. And there's a really useful exercise in your workbook that you can do. I really encourage you to get a few of your a few key people in your organization around the table, in the current world, around a virtual table. We've used tools like Miro boards and Jamboards quite effectively to do this, but it's a network mapping exercise, and the whole idea is to start to map those networks. So there's a whole step-by-step process outlined from page 17 in your guide, but it can be a really, really useful tool, and I found that really helpful in planning for our campaign last year, to start to unlock some of my trustees' networks, because I knew they had great networks, I just didn't quite know how to get to them. But by getting them around a Zoom call, starting to map those out and visually, and we got them really thinking about, okay, so if we want to try and get some corporate partners involved, who is it that we actually know, and who could send them the communications, because if I send it and I don't know them, it's just not going to be read. So who's going to sort of be that broker and that person who introduces the relationship? So I'd really recommend it as an exercise to go through, just to help unlock some of those, but also to help your colleagues and others in your organization understand as well that to make the most of those contacts, they might have to play a role in facilitating that as well. So I've got a case study from the Peak District National Park, who really nailed their messaging. So we'll come back to that in the bit about telling your story. But I feel like they got the messaging really, really clear. They worked out the need, the solution and the impact, and they kept it really high level, big picture, but there was robust science sitting behind it for those of their audience that were really interested. So they started with that network mapping exercise to identify their priority audiences. They came up with things like local community groups, walking clubs, corporate staff, media contacts, and tourism organisations. And then they worked out the best way to contact each group. So they had offline conversations in advance, and by that I mean telephone calls and Zoom calls in advance, but not email. That had conversations in advance with them to enthuse them, to ask them to share the message when it's launched, and they sent each of them a digital promotional pack with images, social media graphics, copy, just to make it really easy for them to copy and paste tweets, hashtags, facts and figures, and quotes. They also hosted a session for volunteers to explain the campaign, and they asked them to donate if they could, share the messages to their networks, and ask them for ideas of how we can promote the campaign. And I think there's something really valuable in that, about they weren't afraid to ask their volunteers to donate and support the campaign as well. And sometimes we can be reluctant, I think, with our volunteers or our staff to ask them to give, but you know, if people don't want to give, they won't, but asking them in a sensitive way and making it clear that it's not an expectation, but if they're able to give, I think can be a really positive thing. And that was something I remember seeing in one of the case studies in the Christmas challenge last year. Someone reflected on the fact that actually it really surprised them how willing their volunteers were to give, but also just how willing they were to share those messages to their networks and ask them for input their ideas about how they could promote the campaign better as well. And they drove people beforehand to sign up to their newsletter. So if you imagine, you know, when the campaign actually launches, you've only got the channels that you've got in place to communicate with the people that you want to. So if you can spend time over the next month, you know, building up your mailing list, making sure that you've got all of those various spreadsheets that exist where people have maybe opted in, they're all on, and if they have opted in, that they're on your mailing list, and making sure that they actually get your communications. And that can help when you get your message for that to go even wider if you've got more people that you're communicating with. Excuse me, I think I'm about to sneeze. I'm okay. They also secured lots of press coverage. So they put out press releases. They got an interview on local radio, on Morelands Radio, BBC Radio Sheffield, BBC Radio Derby. They got features in printed newspapers, online news forums, Facebook pages, parish council magazines. So they really got that word out. And pre-launch, they spent all of their energies on the social media focus, getting people signed up to the newsletter so that they were a more captive audience. And that's the point I was making before. You know, you can't guarantee with the way that the algorithms work, and you do want to have social media as part of your campaign during the week, but really think about how you can also use it in the lead up to the week to get people onto your mailing list. Through their effort in that, they got 100+ new newsletter subscribers from encouraging it through their social media campaigns, but they got 100 new donors as well that weren't previously in contact with their organization. And that was through all of their activity, the press, the social media. They also had some educational achievements. So one of their objectives was about actually increasing people's, nothing to do with the campaign, but improving an educational element, improving people's understanding of the importance of sphagnum moss to the fight against climate change, and 65% said yes. So again, what gets measured tends to get done, as the saying goes. And so if you're building that thinking in at the beginning, if you've got an educational element to your campaign as well, make sure that you are measuring that throughout. So I hope that sort of helped to illustrate just that value of really thinking carefully about your audiences, really thinking about how they're currently engaging with you and how you want to engage with them, and how you'll be able to communicate with them throughout your campaign. Are there any questions at this point, Sahil, that you want me to go over?
There is one from Sean Lewicki that says, talking about press coverage, the story about just being selected for the Green Match Fund isn't enough of a story. What angle should they use?
That's an interesting one. I guess, I mean, it might be enough of a story in itself. It sort of depends how unique your proposition is, I suppose. But I think, and I must caveat this by saying I'm not a press expert. In fact, I think there have been some previous recorded webinars, Sahil, that might be quite useful. I think it was at C&I, I'm trying to remember who ran them. But really it's about finding the what's the hook for them and why is it relevant and interesting to their readership. And again, that might be slightly different if it's a very, if your activity is fairly localized, then actually the fact that a local organization has secured this match funding and is through that funding doing something really incredible with the work. I think that's the piece of it, is what is it that you're trying to achieve with that funding, and why does that matter to people? So if you have a look at the national park example, we've got this hero in the fight against global warming found right here in the Peak District National Park. There's that sort of local hook that makes it relevant. So I'd definitely be trying to think about who is their readership and why is our story of interest to them when you're thinking about which angle to go for.
Yeah, and that is a good suggestion as well about the webinar. So we held a sort of webinar about PR and getting stories into the press for the Christmas challenge with Becky Slack from Slack Communications. It's on our YouTube channel, so if you visit our YouTube channel, you can find the recording of the webinar, and we'll also be posting this webinar on our channel as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I thought there was one somewhere. So that links quite well onto the next section, really, which is all about telling your story. Interestingly, Garfield Weston Foundation recently did produced a report. I don't know if you've read it, but it was called Prioritizing Our Planet. And it highlighted the need for environmental charities to improve their storytelling. They talked about the fact, so this was a report last year, they said charitable organizations need to become stronger storytellers to effectively communicate their story and their goals in a way that attracts funders as well as inspire greater public action. And I think there's something in there. I don't think it's something unique to environmental charities, by the way. I've just come off a webinar with another organization really talking about how to hone that story and tell it, and how to overcome, when there's often very technical and scientific aspects behind what you're doing, and being able to communicate that clearly and simply in a way that inspires your donors and supporters to take action is really, really challenging. So Slack Communications, who Sahil mentioned in relation to the PR coverage, also came up with this framework for telling your story. So it's about matching the need. So why was your work needed? What will happen if you don't do it? With the solution, what is it that you're going to do, and why is that the right approach? Which leads to the impact. What changes because of what you do, and why does that matter to the person who is reading your email or seeing your social media post or watching your video? So if we think about our last example, the why does this matter? Sphagnum moss might, and I don't even know if I've pronounced that correctly, but I'm just going for magnum, but with an SPH at the beginning. Sphagnum moss might be important to you and your research team if you're part of that organization, but why does the average reader care about it? So they took out they explained what it was. They used really engaging language and made it about, why should I care? Well, this is our superhero here from our local area fighting climate change. Why does this matter? Why now? You need to try and create some urgency. Why should someone donate to you now and respond now? And why is it important that you do what you're doing now? So as I say, there is some inbuilt urgency already created by the fact that this campaign is just a week long, but it's also about the urgency of why we need to take action in this particular issue or to address this particular challenge now. Take out the jargon, and I mean really take it out. I read a case for support recently for a rivers charity that talked about silt, monocultures, inundation of the floodplain that might seem obvious to you, but it didn't seem obvious to me. And it won't to everybody. So make sure that you test out your messaging with someone who has no idea about your work. And as we saw in the example previously, when something has a particular name, we can't avoid referencing that. But what they did was just put in really clear, simple, everyday language. They talked about the function and what that moss achieved. Bring it to life. Can you use images or videos or animations or specific examples to bring quite abstract concepts to life? Maybe you could focus on a specific story, perhaps a success you've had in a past, or a particular struggle that the impact of climate change or environmental issues is having on one person or one place. Focus on the change that you make, not the what or why. And this comes back to the need, solution, and impact, really focusing on the impact. Donors are much more driven by the impact than necessarily the specific activities that you're going to deliver in order to achieve that impact. And I've mentioned previously, highlight that match funding. We know that it motivates people to give. Global Witness, who were the challenge winners in 2020, saw a staggering 1,400% increase. So that's 1,400% increase in donations from UK supporters through the challenge compared to their normal appeals that they run. And they surmised that that was because of their because of the match funding element was a powerful motivator behind that. And finally, just ensuring that your messaging is empowering. Avoid those sort of rescuing or savior narratives that sometimes we can fall into the trap of. There's some really good guidance. I'll find the thread and share it with Sahil, but we've recently been looking at it in relation to how in the organisation I work for, how we communicate and encourage the charities we work with to communicate the stories of their beneficiaries and their case studies, about sort of not positioning someone as the victim and ourselves as the saviour, but having a much more empowering approach. And then finally, test your messaging with others. Get some honest feedback on it. Remember, the average reading age in the UK is apparently 9 years old. So just bear that in mind. And there are great tools, even just in Word or on the Hemingway app, where you can actually copy and paste in your words and check the readability level of that. That's a useful external check as well. So a really great case study here was from Bees for Development. So they were raising funds to tackle the growing problem of chemical pesticides in a particular region, in the Amhara region, which was harming bees and people, in fact. And they were concerned that the topic wouldn't be as appealing to donors as their previous year's flagship projects have had, which dealt with much more emotive topics of child poverty, arranged marriage, and school dropouts. They were all sensitive topics for urgent donation. So from their main publicity push with general audiences, they made sure they made the link with the importance of helping families at Christmas by supporting people, by making their livelihoods and family security more resilient. Where they had the opportunity to describe the project in more detail, they knew they had a significant interest in the work. They were able to be more specific about the project themselves, but they didn't overwhelm people with the first contact with lots and lots of detail. So they told personal stories. They featured the updated story of an individual called Mulu, who they visited in November 2019, and they showed his progress as a case study on how their work makes a positive difference. The fact that he was able to do well, he was able to send his children to school, and now he trains others in keeping bees. So their top tips, their learning that they took away from last year's Christmas challenge was be ambitious, and that comes back to that balancing ambition with reality. You know, do stretch yourself. There's a great opportunity with this campaign, and unlike some of the other platforms that exist out there, you know, even if you don't hit your campaign target, you will still get that match funding. So there's almost, it reduces some of the way the Big Give have structured it, have reduced some of that risk for you. So take that opportunity and be ambitious in your goals. When you've got that ambition, you can find the new audiences to support the charity, particularly if you've got the benefit of a challenge to really focus and hone minds. They also talked about how important it was to have positive messages and being able to really show how donors could make a difference on the ground, and how that support would make direct impact on families in their particular situation. And of course, for you, if your work isn't directly centered on working with individuals, you can still tell that compelling story, just like we saw in the Peaks National Park. So there are some more exercises that you can use to work through in your workbook, but I'd love to see if anyone's got some examples of how they can pull together a snappy message, focusing on the need and the solution and the impact. So if you've got something, please do drop it into the chat, and we'd love to see some examples from you.
Hi, Janine. While we just wait for some people to submit some examples, we did have a question from Sean Lewicki. She's asking, how can they try and encourage donors to give above the match funding promised by the Big Give? So I guess once they've run out of match funds, how can they encourage people to carry on giving? For the Christmas Challenge, we obviously have the Christmas Challenge Awards to encourage charities, but we don't have that available for the Green Match Fund. So do you have any other sort of tips on how for charities to keep on encouraging donors to give after they've reached their target?
Yeah, I mean, we in the Christmas Challenge that the charity I'm a trustee of last year, we had exhausted our pledge funds and our match funds with about 24 hours to go. I must admit, for most people, the motivator was still there to donate because it was really clear in the messaging what would happen. I can't remember whether the Big Give has standardized messaging, or if there's a chance to, is there an opportunity to edit your page after the campaign's launched, Sahil?
There is a updates function, so
yeah,
it appears as an extra tab.
That's right. Yeah, and I think so. What I use the updates tab to just post things like, you know, our match funding has now all been allocated, but your support is still really important, and here's why, and connecting it back to that need, solution, and impact. I suppose the other aspect is, can organisations can they can add to their match funding pot, can't they? So that might be the other thing, is if you've not been awarded as much as you thought you would, but you feel reasonably confident in achieving the objective that you originally set yourself, you might speak to one of your more significant donors to see if they would top up your match pot, and then you've got that ongoing motivation for your donors through the campaign.
Yes, that's correct. Charities can top up the match funding pot. We sent an email about that. I think it was last week or the week before. And just to be aware, the deadline to do that is the 16th of April. But if you get in touch with us, we can let you know how you can go about doing that.
Brilliant, thank you. But yeah, I think it really comes back to the match funding as a valuable motivator. But if you get to the end of it and if you have exhausted, having your proposition being really strong, making sure you're communicating that need, solution and impact in your messages, that will really help to inspire and support. So I'm not seeing any coming through on the chat, but that's absolutely, oh yes, I have. Yes, I have. Brilliant. So from Gabriella, yes, so the next generation of wildlife filmmakers and conservationists have missed out on many opportunities for work experience and skills development this year as an impact of COVID-19. So I like that grounds it in the here and now. We're working to build a training program and mentorship scheme using our incredible industry contacts. Empowering the next generation will allow them to make their first steps in the industry and tell authentic and original stories about the natural world. So you've captured that in 3 sentences. You've captured why your work is important, what it is that you're going to do, in big picture terms, and what difference that's going to make, allowing them to make their first steps in an industry. And I love some of the language that you've used, your incredible industry contacts and telling authentic and original stories. So thank you for sharing that, Gabriella. And I think it's just really interesting how that grounds it in the why now, because, we are emerging from a pandemic and there's a whole cohort of people that have not had the opportunities. So sounds really great. Thank you for sharing. Right, so moving on to promotional channels. My advice with the promotional channels is really to remember that your end goal during the campaign itself is to get people to your challenge page. So make it really easy for them. So I wouldn't, for example, from a website, from social media, being directing people to your website, which then they have to click again to find your campaign. Get them straight to your challenge page. However, in the lead up to the campaign, you might be doing something differently. You might be encouraging them to sign up to your newsletter, for example, or to follow your social media accounts. So think about your promotional challenges for promotional channels, I should say, for different phases of your campaign. And think about what channels you already use to engage with your audiences. If up to this point you've had zero profile or engagement on Instagram, probably a month out before, or less than a month out before the challenge starts, isn't the time to set up something from scratch, because you'll spend a lot of time and effort trying to develop your follower base and trying to get momentum there. I would instead focus on the things that you're already doing, and then think about who's the audience that's engaging with me on there. And where are my gaps? Going back to my people and the mapping I did at the beginning, who am I not reaching and how am I going to reach them? So your website should be the starting point for your promotional activity, making sure that you've got some prominent information about the challenge on your homepage and in the support us section. And keep it updated, keep the content dynamic, update it through the week, give progress updates, share different stories. You could be doing that in the lead up to the campaign as well. So I've seen great things where people have put kind of save the dates and countdowns, sort of widgets on their website to keep that dynamic as well. Email has been rated as one of the most successful channels from previous challenge participants. So make sure that you plan several targeted emails. This might be a save the date. It could be sharing the early news now that you've been delighted to have it confirmed that you've been successful. This is what you want to do, what you want to achieve. Then you might send an email on launch day, a progress update, and a final update and thank you. Direct mail is another tool. So particularly if one of your audience segments tends to engage more by mail, and we've got an example shortly from Renewable World who used mail really well, but maybe give them a personalized link that's really easy to follow, and make sure you get it out in good time. Even more so at the moment, because I know in some areas Royal Mail has had challenges with deliveries and postage delays, so you really want to be getting that out in good time. Think about your social media, whether you use Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. You just want to make sure that your social media is planned as well. So think about who actually engages with you on social media and what information is most relevant to them. So for example, it might be mainly your volunteers who are engaging on Facebook, and your and others already involved in your organization. So make sure that the wording of your post is relevant to a wider audience, and ask them to share, not just your direct followers. So a nice example that Bees for Development on the previous slide did, they had a social media influencer who offered to donate £1 per retweet of their tweet, and they got 500 retweets. So not only did that help them to get some direct donations into the campaign, but actually they also increased their impressions and their reach with their messages as well. Events can be a great opportunity to tell your supporters about the challenge and let them know how they can take part. So you could host an event on Zoom with explaining to people, using the opportunity to show video, show images, showcase the impact of it. And you could do that maybe early on in the campaign with then a link shared to donate. Personal approaches are really important for those that you're asking to make larger gifts, and I would tend to do that in the lead up to the campaign, not during the week itself, but get your ducks in a row and have them lined up ready to make a gift if it's going to be a more significant donation. So go back to your network mapping and think about who's best to make the approach. Is it you? Is it one of your team? Is it one of your trustees? Think about their motivations and what it is that you want from them. We've definitely seen that past challenge participants have used individual approaches as part of their campaign promotion, and it remains really, really important, particularly if you can go out on launch day and already know that you've got several of your donors lined up on that first day. I can speak from personal experience that you'll just sleep easier that week, knowing that that's in place. And finally, press and PR. Press can be a really great way to reach new supporters. So take time, as I talked about before, think about their readership and what sort of story will resonate with them. And do your research early so that you know when their publication and copy deadlines are. So you might have just a bit of reflection as we go through the next case study to think about, well, what are the promotional channels we'll use? What have we got in place already? And again, in your guidebook, there's an exercise you can go through for this. But actually, do we have this in place already? What do I need to do to get it up to speed for our campaign? And what things will I not focus on? Because also, if you're a smaller team, or it's you're the person leading on it and you don't have a great deal of support and resource, focusing on 3 or 4 key channels instead of trying to do everything is often a better use of time as well. So Renewable World, they tackle poverty. They contribute to the reduction of poverty through renewable energy. They raised last year in their Christmas Challenge campaign, they raised 20k from 55 donors, and then an additional 5,000 from their sponsors separately. And they'd never done this kind of fundraising before. So for everybody on this, the 75% of you who, for you, this is your first campaign, take heart. Because it can be really exciting, and these campaigns can be huge successes as well. They really thought through their each audience and what their best channel was for each. So they reached out to non-email supporters, so those that were on a postal mailing list through a personalised postcard. It landed with around 1,500 supporters on the 1st of December. And they concluded that it worked extremely well as a tactic, with one lapsed donor who was not contactable by email giving £1,000. And they felt that it really worked as a treat for staff and trustees and volunteers past and present, something they could stick on the fridge, paying dividends in donations that came through. They set up a WhatsApp group for trustees, alumni and staff, and they used the same simple artwork and messaging in this. And throughout the journey, they thought about their different audiences. So they've been running, they've had corporate fundraising and challenge events for a long time. They were set up by engineers from within the UK and Irish renewables sector. So they were good at engaging with corporates, but they've got a very small individual giving base. So for them, the campaign was an incredible opportunity to convert some of their corporate supporters to become senior people within those corporates, to make personal donations. The campaign achieved upgrades from committed givers to one-off cash donations for the first time, and it gave them a way to bring back lapsed donors who had last given in sort of 2015, 2016. So next year, they're going to try more interactive and live content, use their ambassadors more, and use videos and social media and blogs. So I think it's just a really good illustration of thinking carefully about those channels and how are you going to reach. Go back to your network mapping and think really carefully about how am I going to reach those people. You know, your website is your shop window, but you have to get people there in the first place. Well, and in the case of this, your campaign page is your shop window. That's where people will be donating to, but you have to get them to see your message and action and respond to it. So I'd really take a lot of learning from that case study and communicate with people in the way that they want to be communicated with. So I'm just going to pause here in case there's any other questions that have come through before we jump in, just to wrap up some final planning tips and overall hints and tips for the campaign.
We haven't had any specific questions, just general questions about case studies which are pointed people to in the right direction. Just having a look if there's actually anything specific. Nothing specific for the last section, so
Brilliant.
I'll sort of carry on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And there will be time if questions occur to you. There'll be time at the end for Q&A as well. So planning tips really, and that's sort of pulling all of this together. So use your guidebook. It's a really great resource, gives you lots of things to think through and lots of steps that you can take. But my advice would definitely be to create as much as you can in advance. You know, your email templates, your thank yous, your social media assets, and if you can pull in people to support you, so much so the better with that. Really great tools for your emails. If you're not using them already, there's several sort of free emailer email tools there that we talk about in your guidebook. We used Canva a lot to create our social media assets and imagery for our newsletter. And the great thing with Canva is that you can use, it will give you different dimensions for different platforms, because the size picture that you want to post on Instagram unhelpfully isn't the same as the size picture that you'll post on LinkedIn. But in fairness, your message will probably change for the two different channels anyway. So but it's just a really useful tool. It can give you all of the different variations on that in Canva. And charity, they've got a free version, but you can actually access their Canva Pro for free as a charity. You just have to go through a process to do that, but it's quite straightforward. Plan out your timeline and key deadlines. So do a bit of working backwards from launch date. What are the things that you need to have done and by when? And within that, factor in time for any, if you've got people that need to sign something off or to approve particular images, or you need to gather some stories and case studies, then really start earlier on that than you think you need to. Just thinking about the fact, we're coming into an Easter period, people may have time off before and after. And don't forget to plan out after the campaign as well. So plan out your stewardship as well and your post campaign communications, not just the week itself. So for example, when I planned our Christmas challenge campaign for the charity that I'm a trustee of, I thought through our comms right up until March, actually, after the campaign. So we were sending little updates of how the project was going with people's support. We were sharing further case studies, and the whole point was to kind of keep the engagement. There were no asks built in there, but I really wanted to keep them engaged so that when we do launch a future campaign, we've got a receptive audience, and they're not only hearing from us when we're asking them for money, we're giving them updates and offering them opportunities to engage with our work beyond the campaign. Invest the time in sorting out your data and systems, pulling all of those records together in one place so that you know who it is that you're communicating with in each of your different segments and how you're reaching them. Whether that is in an Excel spreadsheet, whether you've got some sort of CRM or contact relationship management software to manage that, but invest that time early on in sorting that. What you don't want is to have someone getting multiple emails because they're on one mailing list, but they're on another one that you've got for another audience segment, and they're just being bombarded by different messages through the week with you. Assign tasks to different people. It can be really, really challenging if it's all on one person. So think about what your colleagues can support with. Can you get some volunteer support? What could trustees do to help? How could volunteers help? Put in some time for reviewing and debriefing. So take a deep breath. It's a big stretch during that week. So do take that opportunity to take a deep breath and a pat on the back once it's over. But then don't leave it until next year and forget about it. Think about what you can learn from what worked and what didn't. What would you do differently? And what achievements do you want to celebrate that? Think as well about how the Big Give fits within a bigger fundraising strategy. Could this form the basis of building up some regular giving or a more a bigger individual giving program over the coming year? So top learning from 2020's Christmas Challenge winners, Global Witness, was going big needs a lot more preparation. So just bear that in mind. If you invest the time in the beginning, you will get those returns many times over. So I'll just finish up on some top tips, and then we'll turn over to a final Q&A. And these are top tips really that have come from previous challenge winners themselves. So Sahil mentioned that there are case studies on the Big Give website of successful campaigns. So mine those, take their learning. But here's just a summary of some of them. So we've talked about the investing time, but invest that time early so that you're really giving yourself the best possible chance of success. Make the most of all of your networks, with trustees, volunteers, corporate staff. Think about your wider networks and think about who can get that message out there for you through their networks as well. Invest some time in developing and testing your message. You want to make sure that it resonates with people. And those that don't have an in-depth understanding or knowledge of the work that you're doing, it still needs to be able to inspire them to give as well. Make sure that you've got a clear call to action, that it's very clear when someone's reading an email from you what you want them to do with that. So, and having that very clear about donating today, donate and have your donation doubled is a really powerful motivator for people to give. Make sure you thank everybody and bring them into your stewardship plans. Use this as a chance to bring supporters closer to the cause. You of course have to be mindful of those that have, you won't have the details of those that didn't opt in, so how can you make sure you get those thank you messages across all of your different channels? So for example, you know, posting thank yous through social media afterwards, posting an update on your website, and using the updates function within the Big Give portal as well. And think about how you'll measure the success. So what is it that you're going to need to measure to know whether your objectives have been met? And if this is your first campaign, you might overshoot, you might undershoot some of your objectives, but if you don't put a line in the sand, if you don't say, this is what we want to achieve with this is why we're investing the time and energy and resources, because we want to raise X amount, we want to secure 25 new donors, we want to bring on board 10 people giving at least £150 each. You know, what are those that you're going to measure to actually know that your objectives have been met, and what's important to your organisation beyond just the cash raised? And that might be a question and a conversation to have with your trustees. You know, when you are reviewing it, what information will they want to know to understand whether this is something that you would want to repeat. And I would say for the most part, organisations have such success through this that it's sort of a given that you'll do it again and again. That's certainly been my experience of it, is that it just grows stronger and stronger every year as you get more as you become more skilled, you learn through your own experience. But you know, you do have to gather that information along the way to make sure that that you can make that assessment at the end about how does this campaign fit within your broader fundraising strategy. And finally, celebrate with your team. Use this as a chance to really motivate. Can be such a difficult time for individuals, but it's also and organisations, but it's also a time where some people, and I recognise not all people, but some people do have higher levels of disposable income, and certainly the research that has been done on sort of giving through the pandemic has said that most people are giving at the same or even higher levels than what they gave 12 months ago or 18 months ago. So there is a real chance to motivate, to generate some buzz in actually what is a bleak time for many, and remembering that, you know, you're not begging people for a donation, but you're giving them an opportunity to connect with something that matters to them and something that matters to all of us as inhabitants in this world. So so just make the most of that opportunity. So I'll draw things to a close here, but we've actually got a little bit more time than we thought. We've got about 20 minutes for Q&A, so please do fire in your questions and we'll tackle them as they come in.
Thank you, Janine. That was really, really interesting, and I hope all the charities have found that useful. I know for us, it's always useful to hear your hints and tips. We did have someone, they just wanted to go over again, if you were able to re-answer the question about how charities can encourage donors to give, to carry on giving once they've hit their target.
Yeah. Again, I think it just comes back to being really clear how the money will make a difference, and even without the match component, I think you can still get that message across. So what will someone's £25 donation enable, or £5 donation, or £250 donation? So kind of pick your amounts. You might need to adjust them to reflect that you no longer have the match funding element, but whilst it is a, you know, it's, the studies have shown that it's a really powerful motivator. If you get donations afterwards, if you are sending messages afterwards, or if people are only clicking to donate, they'll still be inspired to support you if the messaging is right, and if they've got that sense of urgency, they can understand, they can picture it in their heads what's going to happen with the money and the difference that will be made. And if you've focused on the impact, that would be what would inspire people to give as well.
Great. And someone asked, what is Canva? And on top of that, do you have any other tools that you'd like to highlight that charities could use?
Yeah, absolutely. So Canva, C-A-N-V-A, is a graphic design tool that you can use. I mean, there's loads in the guidebook, but some I would focus on. Canva for graphic design. We use MailChimp for our mailing. They've got a free account. Yes, good tip from Phoebe. The pro version is free for charities and it's got way better features. Yes, Esther as well, using MailChimp for sending email newsletters. What I like about that is that we used MailChimp for the first time last year when we did our Christmas challenge campaign. And for me, it was really good learning that we'll take into future campaign planning. We sort of got better at they've got loads of hints and tips in MailChimp. So we got much better at our email subject lines because that's the thing that's going to persuade someone to open your email in the first place and see your message. They had some really good design features, but also we could test different messaging on our mailing list, and we could test different times of day to be sending emails, what see greater open rates, what saw greater click-through rates, and actually what generated. And we'll take all of that learning into any future campaigns that we run. There's been a question around the discrepancy between the amount for the whole project and the amount needed for match funding. And I guess I won't answer that piece of it because Alex addressed that at the very beginning, just at how oversubscribed this and popular this fund was. How do we demonstrate the impact of this relatively small amount of this part of the campaign? I guess having what you might want to think about is, can you kind of earmark a particular aspect of that project and focus on that? I don't know without further detail about whether you will still go ahead and seek to raise the funds for the project as a whole from elsewhere, or if you'll actually be reducing your project within the campaign. But I think, you know, it's about, well, what tangible thing can be produced from what you're raising through the campaign itself. And I suppose the other side of it is, can you speak to any of the, you know, if you thought that you were going to be able to go out publicly and raise a much higher amount, can you bring any of those sort of higher level donors on to add to your matching pot, which will help you to maybe to inspire others to give as well?
Great. There are loads of questions coming through now. So
okay.
One, what would you say that are the key factors to consider when segmenting email comms with existing / previous donors on databases, and what are the key points to tailor?
Yeah, I suppose my biggest, I would tend to, I mean, the factors you probably want to take into account is, and this isn't specific, this is general, just because I don't know personal circumstances or sort of each organization's circumstances, but I'd be thinking about, well, what's my overall level of contacts as a whole? So in my small organization, for example, that I'm a trustee of, you know, we don't have huge levels of donors. So we've earmarked 4 or 5 that we've identified have the potential to be high level donors, and they get very personalized communications. In fact, 2 of them have been high level donors in the past. They don't come onto our general sort of email pushes. They get very personalized approaches via one of the founder trustees. But everybody else that's opted into our mailing list gets the communications through that, because we just simply don't have the resources for, we're talking about a mailing list of 120 people, I think. We just don't have the resources or the manpower. We've got no UK-based staff. I chair the fundraising committee, so I've got an amazing group of volunteers, but it just doesn't make sense for us to segment any further than that. We kind of keep our potential high-level donors separate, and everybody else appears on, everybody else gets the same email. And we just make it speak to different gift levels. So sort of we talk about what difference a £10, a £25 and a £100 donation can make, linked to some very tangible benefits. If you had a much larger mailing list, if you're more experienced with individual giving, just think about your different giving categories. You know, you might sort of have a low level, a mid level, and a sort of major level donation. You might do things slightly differently for current people who have donated to you within the last 12 months versus those that haven't donated to you for sort of 2 years or more, for example. So I think it's just about choosing what makes most sense to you. You might have a slightly different message for or a different approach for corporates, for example, than you do for people that you're approaching on an individual basis. And again, it might be much more kind of personalized, not through a mailing list, but through telephone calls and one-to-one emails that you're making those approaches with those corporates. So it does have to, it's going to vary a lot between the different organizations, but I suppose the factors I would take into account might be the amount of their giving, whether they've given to you recently, how long they've been supporting you, and whether you think they've got potential to be a more significant donor in the future as well, because you might want to be taking a lot more personalized effort to cultivate that relationship.
Great. And just on that, is that for some charities, they may want to sort of try and engage with their trustees and utilize their networks. Do you have any specific tips for that, like asking trustees to?
Yeah, I do. I talk about this from experience. I don't know if anyone, I won't name names just in case anyone's on this call, but I found, so I came into the organisation, I'm a trustee of about 2 weeks before the launch of our Christmas Challenge campaign 2 years ago. And I think there was maybe a perception with trustees that as I was taking a lead on the campaign, they didn't really have to get involved or do anything. I was going to take care of it all. And I think for me, what I didn't manage to get them on board with that year, but what I learned for the following year, was I needed to get their engagement very early. So what I did with them, I did the piece around setting our campaign objectives. I asked for half an hour in the agenda of a trustee meeting prior to the campaign. And I shared those objectives with them and asked them for their input. Was there anything else that they'd want to see? What would success look like for them? They were all in agreement with it. And then I took them through to my detailed planning. I said, right, if we're going to achieve this, this is what we need to do. We need to be able to get 10 people giving at this level. I did a bit of a gift table for them. So gift table and fundraising, you sort of get your gift levels, and you'll typically have fewer people at the top of your table giving you larger amounts. So I said we needed to have 4 donors give us at least £250. I then went down to the next level, the kind of the 100, the 25. And as you go down the levels, you've got more and more people. So you've got more people giving you a £5 than you do giving you £250. And when I totted that up, I said, so between us, we now have to reach 300 new donors. So how are we going to make that happen? And I really involved them from that early stage. So I presented them with the objectives, the what could be, and got them really excited about that, but made it really, really clear I needed their help to do that. It wasn't something I could do alone. So we did a brainstorming session then of how we could, and I did this all over Teams and Zoom. I used Jamboard, which is the Google tool, and you can have like mind mapping and post-it notes and things like that. So we did a brainstorming first and foremost about how we could get the word out. And then I, within that session, allocated not necessarily the doing of things, but actually, well, since you've got links with those corporates, John, let's say, I'm going to touch base with you next week and let's come up with a plan. I'm going to get a call in the diary and we can come up with a specific plan for those. So it did take a lot of work to get them involved. But it made such a difference. In fact, we got a not unsolicited, but in response to our campaign message going out through one of the trustee networks, we had a foundation that had been on our radar that was closed to unsolicited applications, send us £1,000 check just completely out of the blue. Didn't count towards our campaign target, but to us it was directly linked to the campaign, the offline donations as well. So I do think there's such value in engaging your trustees early, and then keeping in touch with them and making it easy. So whenever I sent I tried not to bombard them, but at key milestone points in the few days before the launch, just a reminder of the things I needed them to do. I gave them stuff that they could copy and paste, and gave them images that they could use to share across their social media. I then gave them a midway update and a last 24 hours update as well. And we also had a WhatsApp group going so that I could give them sort of further pushes through that.
Right. And just speaking of bombarding, there was an interesting question from one charity saying that they're running multiple campaigns around the similar time as Green Match Fund. Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions on promoting the Green Match Fund when you have other campaigns also running at the same time?
Yeah.
Bombard people with.
I think that's where your segmentation will become really important, because I think what you might want to think about is who's my audience for this campaign and who's my audience for the other campaigns that we're running. And I would not promote multiple campaigns to the same audience group, because it becomes confusing for people about, well, what do you want me to do, and which one do you want me to donate to, and which one should I donate to? And they become, you know, there's all of that research about when we're being asked to make decisions about things, it takes, you know, there's the cognitive load that goes with that. There's a risk that they just don't end up donating to either of them because they can't make that decision. Yeah. So I think be very careful about it. It's definitely something we learned. We tried to run a more of a corporate focused campaign alongside our Christmas challenge last year, and I don't think it'll be something we do again, because at the end of the day our corporates were still able to give to our match funding campaign, and I think some of my trustees maybe got confused and sent on all of the messages, and therefore it just became confusing for people. So I would just be very, very mindful of who you're communicating, and if there is some time between them, if it's maybe over a 3-month period or something, you can use one to piggyback onto the other. So kind of hook them in, and then make sure that you steward and you feed back the impact of their giving, but they might be sort of ripe and prime for another campaign coming down the line as well.
Yeah, I think on the segmentation thing, especially like if charities have access to what type of campaigns donors have given to them before, that's particularly useful to which campaigns target to which donors.
Yeah.
A sort of similar question is, there's an environmental education charity with a dual purpose of helping the planet and increasing children's connections with nature. Should they focus on one for the campaign and combine the two together, or send almost double messaging throughout to appeal to different audiences?
Yeah, you might want to look at it through that sort of last lens, I suppose, is think about which, for your different audiences, which element of it is most inspiring and interesting to them. So, if you were reaching out through other environmental sort of education, with that focus on the impact on the planet, and you wanted to engage people, or people support you because of that work, that might be the lens that you focus on. I mean, I wonder if you can get a group of sort of critical friends together, if you like, maybe come up with a few different messages that focus on different aspects of that, and get some, a group of people connected with your organization but not directly invested in the campaign or responsible for it, that are sort of external, and get their feedback on it. I find people love to be asked for their opinion, and if it's the case of a half-hour Zoom to get your advice as we sort of do something for the first time, that can be really helpful. But yeah, I think it might just come back to, rather than trying to be all things to all people, it might be trying to be something, presenting your work in a specific way with some audience and some with others. And it's probably very likely that both aspects of your work are very, very compelling. And the piece of advice I'll always remember someone giving to me very early in my career was that I needed to adopt. I used to become sort of quite despondent if you didn't get the donation, or you didn't get the grant or the sponsor. And they said that you have to adopt a Chelsea mindset. So the postcode in Chelsea is SW3. And so it stands for some will, some won't, so what? which is a very blunt way of putting it, but it's just remembering that, you know, your campaign messaging will not land with 100% of the people that you communicate it with. But what you can do is just give yourself the best chance of success by thinking about what their interests and their motivations are. And that will help more people to actually click that button and go on and make a donation. But there will always be some that don't do it, and that doesn't mean that your messaging wasn't strong or that your case wasn't compelling. It just meant that they sort of fell into that latter SW, the third one.
Yeah, and I think in the guidebook we had an example from Tommy's where they actually sort of polled their existing donors about the types of messaging that works with them.
Yeah,
charities have time to do that. Asking their donors would be a great way to sort of get that information. Just some practical questions here about when does the campaign page go live. So the campaign page link is already available via your campaign dashboard. So if charities go to the campaign dashboard, click on view campaign page. That link is what you need to share with donors, and the donate button will appear on your campaign page when the campaign starts on the 22nd of April. So are there any case studies, examples of effective video content that can engage an audience? So if you go to the Christmas challenge page on our website, if you go to our website, click on how can we help, click on Christmas challenge and scroll to the bottom, we have some case studies from the award winners from the Christmas challenge, and they have really good examples of video content that worked for them and examples of how they produced it. And more often than not, I'll throw this back to Janine, but more often than not, you don't need any fancy equipment to make videos for a campaign, just your phone. Sometimes that even lends a more sort of more feel of authenticity to what you're messaging.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a recognition, you know, making good video content with your smartphone is definitely something, excuse me, that can be used to really great effect. Yeah.
And lastly, I think this is probably a very sort of personal question to depending on your charity, but Ruth Marshall is asking, what do you consider to be a high level donation? I guess that depends on your charity and its size. And
absolutely, yeah. So for us, you know, to be able to get people to donate at £250 or more was quite a stretch, because, you know, we'd had those few who had been quite high level donors, but the average donation coming through our donation link on our website, for example, was about 20 quid. So so it will be dependent on your context, the context of your organization and your past experience with donors. But if you've got a fairly low donor base, you know, you might be looking at sort of £50 and above, for example.
And I think that's all the questions, but we'll throw one last question out to all of us panelists. What's the one thing you'd want charities to take away from this webinar? I'll let Alex go first, because he hasn't spoken in a while.
Yeah, great question. Just to also, before I answer, call out Esther's made a good point in the chat around using bit.ly links. So someone asked earlier about the kind of campaign URL. So Sahil directed you where you can find that, but using bit.ly links is a great way to kind of shorten it or make a memorable link. So that's a good piece of advice. Thanks, Esther. My one thing to take away from today, which sounds really obvious, but I think just make sure you emphasize the fact that donations are going to be doubled in your messaging. We've done lots of research and seen lots of evidence which points towards the fact that match funding is a great way to get more people to give and for people to give more as well. So yeah, I've seen examples in the past where people have highlighted their campaign but haven't really talked about the fact that donations are going to be doubled. So I would say really emphasize that point.
Janine, what would be your one?
My takeaway would just be how brilliant these campaigns are to really galvanize, and I'm just so mindful of how many people on this call are new to campaigns like this. It does feel a bit scary first time going into it, but there is so much support from the Big Give. There's some fantastic resources, and work through the steps, invest the time in planning, but it's so worth it. You'll really galvanize people behind it, and it's a great way of really raising the profile of individual giving more generally within your organization as well.
I think I'd sort of echo one of your points there is do all the planning before the campaign starts. We've seen so many cases of charities which are successful in our other campaigns are the ones that put the time and effort in planning. So if you do that planning, you give such a better chance of your campaign being successful. And also the campaign week as well will normally go really quickly. So if you have all your Twitter posts drafted and lined up, it saves you so much work and stress during the actual campaign week.
Absolutely, and make sure someone else has access to your logins just in case anything happens to you.
That's a great tip as well. I think those are all the questions. So yeah, I want to again thank you, Janine, for joining us today. Hope your little boy has a good day celebrating.
Yeah.
Thanks to all the charities for joining us today. Thank you all for your interactions. It's been really encouraging for us and exciting to see how you're all excited for the campaign. And this webinar has been recorded and we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel. So thank you all and have a lovely day. Bye.